All right. In this unit, we're going to be looking at the flows of energy and matter through ecosystems. And here's kind of the overall topics that you're going to need to know by the time we're done with 2.3. It's you're going to need to look at how energy moves through ecosystems, and that includes the fate of solar radiation, how it reaches the Earth. That's actually what we're going to focus on in this screencast. You're also going to need to look at productivity. We're actually going to spend a lot of time on productivity. You need to know what is productivity. There's a couple of different types of productivity that you need to know. You need to know how do we measure productivity if we were to do that in a lab. And then what are factors that influence the productivity of an ecosystem? So what are the things that limit productivity? What are things that can enhance productivity? And then in our next lesson, we're going to be looking at how matter cycles in ecosystems, and you're going to need to be able to draw systems diagrams of both the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, describing how those bits of matter cycle around within an ecosystem, and then you should be able to outline how humans impact both of those cycles. Okay. All right. So in this screencast, we're going to be focusing on the fate of solar radiation. Okay. So we're going to focus on the energy for this whole lesson, but this particular screencast is just looking at solar radiation as it reaches the Earth, what's going on there, what is then available in ecosystems. So this is one of the first understandings that IB put out there. It's when solar radiation, another name for that is insolation, when that enters the Earth's atmosphere, not all of it is actually going to come down to the Earth and be able to be used by plants and turn into plant biomass. Because we know in photosynthesis, plants are taking sunlight energy and they're turning it essentially into chemical energy in the form of biomass in glucose organic molecules. And so not all of the solar radiation that hits the Earth, we know this, is going to be instantly converted into chemical energy. Much of that is going to be unavailable to the ecosystem because it's either absorbed by something that's not a plant or it gets reflected back into the atmosphere. So just taking a look at solar radiation coming into the Earth, here's of all of the solar radiation that comes into the Earth, 31% of that's going to be reflected and about 69 will actually be absorbed. Now, what it's absorbed by, of course, is important. So here's all the parts that are going to be reflected. Some of it's going to be reflected by the atmosphere, and some of that is going to be like the clouds. Clouds will be very important in moderating the atmospheric temperatures and things. But then the ground, ice reflects solar radiation very, very well, like a mirror. So a lot of this energy actually just gets reflected off. So that's about 30%. The other 70% is going to be absorbed, but much of that's going to be absorbed by the atmosphere, molecules of dust and clouds and other things. So essentially, out of all of the solar radiation coming into Earth, only about 50% of that is actually absorbed by the Earth itself. Okay, so all that solar radiation, the UV, the visible light, only about half of that coming from the sun is actually absorbed by the planet. Okay, but not all of that that's absorbed is actually being absorbed by plants, which is kind of a big deal because it's the plants that need to convert the energy into chemical energy to be used within ecosystems. So as the solar radiation comes in, we get about half absorbed by the planet. Some of that could be in the oceans, it could be in soil, exposed soil, different things. And some of it will actually reach plants. Okay, so half. And then the pathways, once it's in an ecosystem, right, where does this energy go? Well, first of all, you can get the conversion of light energy into chemical energy. That's the big important first step in energy within an ecosystem. That's the fixation. That's how energy is fixed. Once that energy is fixed, that chemical energy can be moved from one trophic level to the next, and varying efficiencies, of course. Some ecosystems are more efficient than others at moving it through. Of course, a lot of this is ultimately, a lot of the energy is actually converted to heat by an ecosystem, and a lot of that heat will then be re-radiated back out to the atmosphere. So let's just take a quick look of the fate of light energy coming in. Now, what we're ultimately looking for, what's available in the ecosystem for all of the, for the food web and for the food chain, is this net primary production. So this is what's going to ultimately be fixed by plants in chemical energy. So if we start with, say, 1,000 joules or kilojoules of sunlight energy, you can see we come down and we only get about 55 of that 1,000 that's actually going to be fixed by plants. Okay, so we start with 1,000 and you only get about 55. You don't need to have these numbers memorized, but just realize it's a very small proportion of what is coming down. What happens to all that other energy? Well, of that 1,000, a lot of it isn't the right wavelength. It's just not available to plants. Maybe it doesn't strike the plant. It's unsuitable wavelengths. Plants can really do well with blue and red wavelengths of light. They absorb those and use those for photosynthesis, but green, they don't, they reflect it, or they just let it transmit right through the leaves. So a lot of that's not available. Some of it gets reflected or transmitted depending on where it hits within the plant, if it's hitting chloroplasts or not. And so of that 1,000, you can see in this diagram, there's about 400 that's actually going to be absorbed by the chloroplasts themselves. And of that gets absorbed by the chloroplasts, only 92 of that will be, about a quarter of it is going to be converted to glucose through photosynthesis. So I would probably label this arrow right here photosynthesis, right? And then that glucose that's available, some of that, of course, will be put to use by the plant to make biomass, but a lot of that's going to be put to use by the plant to make chemical energy in the form of ATP. So they're going to burn it through cell respiration. So the plants will fix this much energy, but they're not going to put it all to their biomass. They're going to use some of it to make ATP. So in the end, you can see the fate of all of that sunlight energy. Only a small fraction of that is actually going to be stored in chemical energy through photosynthesis.